The topic for my presentation is Does exposure to media violence increase an individual's likelihood of engaging in violent behaviour? The article I will be using is one that I used in my article matrix assignment. It has 4 authors and is titled The More You Play, the More Aggressive You Become, a long-term experimental study of cumulative violent video game effects on hostile expectations and aggressive behaviours. It was published in 2013 and it was published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. As you can see, there will be a little PowerPoint presentation next to my face throughout this video, and it will just be reference points referring back to the things that I'm discussing in this presentation. The article itself aims to provide some sort of credible evidence to the current well-established theory that an increase of aggression may be directly linked to exposure of violence in the media to many of our new individuals in society. It is well known with the progression of social media, television, and video games that individuals in society are much more exposed to violence in the media than they did many years ago. Therefore, the authors of this article conducted an experiment to test the cumulative effects on behaviour of violent video games. Their hypothesis was that violent video games will increase hostile expectations and aggressive behaviours, and that these effects would become stronger from each day. Therefore, there would be a cumulative effect of aggressive behaviours that would build up over time. The experiment was conducted with 70 French university students as participants. 35 were female and 35 were male to allow for equal gender-based data. The average age was 24.4 years old, which is very relevant to the modern day, given that this was the age group that would be most targeted by violent media. And they were paid €10 per day for their 3 days of participation. The participants were randomly assigned a violent or a non-violent game in which they were to play for 20 minutes straight once a day for 3 days. The participants were informed that the effects of the brightness of the screen that the games were being played on was what was being researched. This is to allow for the data to be completely accurate, as this is a qualitative study, and if the participants were told that their emotions were being monitored, then potentially they have the ability to manipulate their emotions, and therefore there might be fabricated or inaccurate data as research evidence. There were 3 different types of games for each category, a non-violent or a violent video game. These were changed every single day, so the participants played a different type of game every day, but still within their non-violent or violent category. Afterwards, each individual would complete a story stem and a competitive computer game against a same-sex opponent. This competitive computer game actually allowed for consequences for the participants, as a winner was allowed to choose the punishment, essentially, of the loser. The loser would receive a high-pitched noise blast through their headphones. This was purely determined by the winner as to how high the noise blast would be and for how long the duration would go for. After this, the participants will complete a final survey regarding their feelings for the video game that they had just played. The results of the experiment showed that the hostile expectations and the aggressive behaviours both increased over a time period for the individuals that played the violent games. As you can see in the graphs, they show that by day 3, both hostile expectations and aggression had increased for those playing the violent video game, but those who were playing the non-violent video game actually decreased their hostile expectations by day 3 and stayed around the same for their aggression levels. The end result of this experiment was that it did support the original hypothesis in which the authors were trying to achieve. However, there are some implications in that this was a qualitative experiment, and therefore the theoretical interpretations need to be considered. Each data would have been interpreted differently to each author, and it's hard to reach a baseline of how to analyse the data critically. The practical applications of this experiment also need to be considered in how the authors went about conducting their experiment. The original hypothesis was whether or not there was any link that could be proven between a violent exposure to media and then an increased risk of aggression, and therefore I think their practical application is valid. Within this experiment, the authors identified some limitations, as well as through critical analysis, there have been some limitations that I identified as well. One limitation was the time frame. The experiment was measured over a period of 3 days. However, the original hypothesis was that the authors wanted to gather a cumulative effect. With a time frame of 3 days, the authors recognized that they could only predict what outcomes would occur in terms of whether or not if the participants were to continue playing these violent video games, that they would have greater instances of aggression as time went on. However, they couldn't prove this as they only had a 3-day time frame. Another variable that was identified was that only holistic expectations and aggressive behaviours were identified. However, people that experience aggression may display it in different types of emotions, and these measurements may have been missed as it wasn't what was being focused on in the focal topic. The last variable was that there was an inconsistency in what time the participants were playing their video games. There are studies that do show that violence and aggression traits can actually be more prominent at night time, and therefore an inconsistency in when the participants were playing their video games might lead to an inaccurate result. Even though there are limitations that have been identified, the overall article does definitely give some credible evidence and advice to the overall discussion topic of, does exposure to media violence increase an individual's likelihood of engaging in violent behaviour? The article itself has produced an experiment that has provided results to support this topic in the affirmative manner.